You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Shelby. Good to be with you.
Roger, today talking about a few different things that could be impacting agriculture, and the first one being the scope of the Dealer Trust Act at issue and something from your recent blog article.
Well, this is a relatively new law, and there is a court case involving over 100 livestock producers that have $122 million in unpaid claims against 3 defunct cattle operations, and a lender says one of the feed yards sold about 78,000 cattle and didn't pay on the loans. And the problem really stems from a $175 million Ponzi and check-kiting scheme that the debtors were engaged in. So it is a mess of a problem for these livestock sellers.
Grain and crops also something important to agriculture. And so is there something possibly that the livestock and cattle side of the industry could learn from them?
Well, we've long had what's known as a PACA trust, the Perishable Ag Commodities Act trust, which says that if I sell grain to, say, an elevator, and the elevator files bankruptcy, I can still get paid. Normally, once bankruptcy is filed, you've got to go through a long process before you get paid. And then if I'm a general unsecured creditor of the bankrupt debtor, I'm at the back of the line. I may not get paid anything. It's the secured creditors that get paid first. And so cash grain sellers, farmers, aren't secured creditors. They're just general creditors. And so Congress recognized that problem many years ago, and they created this separate trust to hold the funds that should be paid to the unpaid cash sellers of grain. And so if the elevator goes bankrupt, those proceeds are not tied up in the bankruptcy estate, and the farmers can get paid. Well, Congress, a couple of years ago, actually, it was legislation signed into law near the end of 2020 that added a new section to the Packers and Stockyards Act that basically creates the same thing on the livestock side of things. So now, if a covered sale barn, for example, or a buyer of livestock in general files bankruptcy, then the unpaid cash sellers of livestock, their funds are held in a separate trust, and their claim is not tied up in the bankruptcy estate, and they can get paid.
So what does this really mean then for producers who may be working with cattle?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out with this case. One issue is what the trust contains for those unpaid livestock sellers. The question is whether it contains all of the assets of the sale barn that went bankrupt, for example. I think it could be, because when we talk about feed yards and cattle operations, practically all the income is from cattle sales. But so far in that case, the USDA has approved for payment only $2.69 million of the claims out of $122 million of those cash sellers' claims for the livestock, claiming that the balance is owed to non-cash sellers that are not covered by the law. And that's what the court is having to sort out. I don't think that was Congress's intent in terms of the way they wrote the law, but this is the first case to test the scope of it, so we shall see.
So does that mean that this case will set the precedent for potential future cases?
Indeed, it will. It's the first one out of the box on this. The law is new, so it's not really clear what is a trust asset for the benefit of the cash livestock sellers and what assets, if any, are in the debtor's bankruptcy estate. But we're looking forward to this first court case to figure that out for us.
And looking forward in the next couple of years, something also important to probably be looking at is, what if Trump tax cuts aren't extended?
Well, those expire at the end of 2025, and if Congress does nothing, we revert back to prior law prior to 2018. And from the income tax side of things, it's going to be a major tax increase for many, many people. And particularly the middle to lower income people will see a greater tax increase proportionally than others will. And so it's important that Congress deals with this issue. And it'd be great if they'd tell us sooner than later as to what the rules are going to be, so that we can advise clients and advise farmers and ranchers as to what they need to be doing from a tax planning standpoint. So that's a big issue. I think a lot of people get caught up, Shelby, on the federal estate tax exemption coming down. Most people have heard about that. There's a lot of writing about that. But the federal estate tax doesn't affect very many people and very few farms and ranches. But if it comes down, of course, it will affect more. But when we talk about the income tax provisions, that hits millions upon millions of people. So it's important to know what changes, what we revert back to compared to where we are now, and what we might be able to do to plan if that's going to be what happens to us.
And you mentioned that middle and lower class, and do you put a few kind of numbers with it of how this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, if it isn't extended, would impact them?
Yeah, for example, people currently in the 10% bracket, which is going to be the lower level of the income scale, middle of the lower, 10 is going to go to 12% starting in 2026. The 12% bracket is going to go to 15. So for those people, 12 to 15, that's a 25% rate increase. 10 to 12 is a 20% tax bracket increase. So your rate's going to go up 20% or 25% if you're in those two ranges. And then the child tax credit's going to get cut in half. It's currently $2,000 per qualified child, and it's going to drop to $1,000. And your refundability of that credit is currently $1,700 per child. That's what the Trump tax cuts took it to. And what that means is if you don't have a tax liability, the government writes you a check of $1,700 per qualified child. So if I have 3 children, and let's say I'm currently in the 10% bracket, I have 3 qualified children, so that's a $6,000 credit. The Trump tax cuts also doubled the standard deduction, so probably wiped out my tax liability. What would happen if Congress does nothing and lets these expire is the standard deduction goes back to its old level, so it's going to get cut basically in half again, so it goes back down to roughly $12,000, $13,000. The Trump tax cuts doubled it, I should have said. Didn't cut it. It doubled the standard deduction, but it would get cut back down. And so now I've got much more likelihood that I owe tax. My child tax credits are going to go to $1,000 per child. So instead of getting a $5,100 check from the government, I now have a $3,000 credit. And if I don't have a tax liability, my refundable portion of credit is much less and may be phased out for me. So, and my rate goes from 10 to 12. If I was in 10% bracket, I'm now in 12. So chances are I go from a position of getting money back from the government to having a tax liability. And people need to be prepared for that, particularly lower income people that live paycheck to paycheck. They may have a nice tax bill when it comes time to pay taxes for the 26th tax year. Now, this is still a couple of years off into the future. So we have to think about these things and be aware of what might happen to us.
And more figures that you included in this recent blog article that you posted discusses how the federal government revenue changed throughout these years.
Yeah, that's right. There was a report put out by the government that noted that in 2017, the year before the Trump tax cuts took effect, revenue to the federal government was $3.3 trillion. In fiscal year 2021, the Treasury took in $4 trillion and $4.9 trillion in fiscal year 2022. But it dropped to $4.44 trillion in fiscal year 23 due to the slowing economy burdened by inflationary economic policies. So economics does matter, is what that tells us in terms of revenue. And there's also a report that the government put out, the U.S. Treasury, along with Harvard, Princeton, the University of Chicago, produced a recent report showing that the Trump tax cuts, particularly corporate tax reform provisions, created a large surge in business investment and economic growth and higher wages for workers and had little impact on government revenue. And I cite that report in my blog. And that's an interesting one because that's the government along with economists from some pretty prominent places, including Harvard and Princeton.
What might people and ag producers might want to start thinking about just in case this doesn't get extended?
Well, I think particularly for ag producers that are not operating in the C corporate form, another thing that will expire at the end of 2025 is the qualified business income deduction, which is a 20% deduction on your business income. So, for example, if I'm in a 24% tax bracket, I can take 20% of that off, and I'm basically down to about 19.6%, which would be my effective tax rate instead of 24%. That's a big deal. If I'm in 37% bracket, I'm going to be down pretty close to 30%. So, and that one's going to go away. I saw a return about 6 weeks ago where for a farming operation in Kansas where the QBI deduction was almost $600,000. That goes to zero if the Trump tax cuts are not extended or that provision is not extended. So that's a big one for farming operations that are sole proprietorships or an S corporation or some type of flow-through entity. As long as they're not a C corporation, they can claim that deduction.
For people who'd like to find out more information or possibly read these blog articles, where can they do that, Roger?
Well, a couple of places, actually 3, through my website. which is washburnlaw.edu/Walter. And then you can access my blog from that homepage. I also share them with Ag Manager's website through the Department of Ag Econ and also on the RFD TV website.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some more information from the law and tax side of things.
My pleasure, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. In today's show notes on actday.net, I will link his blog article that discusses these topics if you'd like to read more information about them. Also in today's show notes, I will link the Kansas Income Tax Institute, as there are a few more dates for that through the end of the year. You can also find it by going to agmanager.info.